New homes. With the massive scale of human displacement from these two major events, the Syrian war and the German expulsion, there are many questions, some logistical, some humanitarian, and some that fall effectively under both categories. This is one of those which falls into both. Where are the people going? How are they being resettled, and where? What are the conditions of this resettlement? Are the homes adequate? Are there even homes for them? How are the conditions of their temporary housing when they arrive? This video will examine these questions, as well as look at how this could affect, or maybe even does affect, the development and growth in some regions. Germany. Germany. Yes, the peoples in the German expulsion weren't expelled from Germany, they were expelled to Germany. There's a plethora of reasons that this was problematic, and there was even a difference by zone as to why there was a problem. First, East versus West. The difference in the remnants of the zone were shocking. The eastern zone, which was largely rural, was less decimated, particularly in the rural areas, than the western zone. This is partly because, again, it is rural, and a majority of the destruction was focused in cities. Secondly, there was a concentration of allies on the western side, which made the western zone's cities easier to reach and hit for Allied bombers. Ergo, the destruction was significantly higher. In Germany, by September of 1945, there were makeshift camps being set up all around the country, 45 outside Berlin alone. A typical camp for this period was a place called the Kruppstrasse in the Tiergarten district. This camp was a former barracks in which all of the buildings were damaged. It contained 400 bunks and 3,000 refugees. An overflow of 600 of them slept amongst the rubble. After being allowed to spend one night at the camp, they were evicted, to make way for the next day's inflow of people. With the large number of people arriving, many of them arriving on foot, some of them never even made it to a camp from this station due to the severe shortage of housing. Thousands of such people never left the stations they arrived in, sleeping on platforms, in freight wagons, or standing in sidings for weeks or months due to an Allied policy decision made in 1945. The number of expellees continued rising, the population of a medium-sized town arriving every day between 1945 and 1946. In 1945, a policy was issued to encourage expellees to bypass Berlin, withholding ration cards from new arrivals in the city. Realistically, all this did was exacerbate the overflow onto the streets. This policy is also the one that led to the overflow in the train stations. Eventually, the situation got so dire that the population densities had changed from perhaps 3 or 4 German people per unit to something closer to 10. People were shoved in cellars, shelters that barely classified as housing. Arid bunkers even became part of the equation as the situation became more dire. One Allied policy, the ACC's Housing Law of March 1946, allowed for the requisitioning of surplus dwelling space, down to the level of even simply vacant rooms. People were confined to camps of all kinds as the crisis continued, from repurposed concentration camps, labor camps, barracks, prisoner of war facilities. There was very little that was requisitioned to supply for the catastrophic levels of overcrowding. Syria, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Europe, and the United States. First, a brief explanation of the way that refugee movement works in today's world. The Syrian war has bred a few different kinds of ways for people to seek asylum. First is to legally or illegally enter a state and claim asylum there. Second is to be recognized as a refugee for resettlement from a country of first asylum. It is important to note that no country is legally obligated to resettle refugees, and only a few offer resettlement on a regular basis. Asylum, however, is a form of protection based on the principle of non-refoulement, and because of this, states do have a legal obligation to provide protection. In neighboring countries, refugees live largely in communities and cities. They live among the population, and in some less common cases, they live in camps when there is not adequate facilities or housing to accommodate them. Mind you, the influx of refugees sometimes creates the inadequacies that make their lives difficult. As the large number of people moves into a new area, the area may end up having basic services overloaded with a new number of people that they were not designed to accommodate. Basic things like food, water, sanitation, and electricity can all become overburdened with this influx. This large-scale acceleration of urban growth has not been matched by the market or by increasing capacity of these basic services. And many areas that have been hit hardest by this influx and economic drain were already among some of the poorest in the region. They've had to absorb the brunt of the refugees, and have had to do so with less resources than other towns and cities in the region. This, logically, can cause tensions and result in a negative feedback cycle, whereas even more people flood in and the crisis drags on, the more and more these places and the people in them will suffer. This can only inevitably exacerbate the humanitarian crisis the area already faces with the war itself. In some countries, there are official camps. Some there are not. Jordan is one country that does not have official camps, and their situation is quite dire. The refugees do not always choose to locate themselves in the camps, and the end result is overcrowding in the urban and rural areas of the country. Many of these refugees are living below the poverty line. Lebanon lacks official camps, and their services have become so over-encumbered with the numbers of refugees flooding in, and in some areas, again, the demand for water and electric is higher than the country's services are capable of providing. With all of that, the lack of official camps means that the refugees living there often build informal shelters or live in informal shelters such as unfinished buildings and garages. Turkey also has official refugee camps, yet again, however, many of the refugees elect to live in cities and towns as opposed to the camps, and that has been causing tension in these towns and cities, as those living outside the camps often live in impoverished conditions and are unable to provide adequate facilities, education, food for themselves. In Iraq, policy changes and escalation in conflicts have resulted in deterioration of asylum space, and in some regions, even the discontinuation of residency permits, which had previously been being issued. Similarly, in Egypt, a political shift has resulted in poorer conditions and broken promises for refugees seeking asylum. Multiple European countries have agreed to accept refugees, including the UK, Germany, and Sweden. The United States has also agreed to take in a certain number of refugees. Now, the number of refugees settling in areas near their home countries such as Iraq, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey is significantly larger than that of those settling in third countries outside the region. Even so, it is important to look at where these people are being sent and perhaps what impact they are having on the areas, if any. Between 2012 and 2014, the US, UK, Sweden, and Germany all saw a growth of nearly 3 times the asylum claims in their countries, and along with that trend, all 4 states have increased the number of refugees that they are accepting each year. The European countries have, to this day, accepted roughly 1 million refugees, whereas America has only accepted something near 33,000 refugees. In Europe, the refugees arrive both by land and sea, crossing the Mediterranean or coming through Turkey and other connected nations. When they arrive, some of the areas which they first meet are less than welcoming. In one processing center, The refugees are met with makeshift tents and poor conditions in which to live until the determination has been made as to where they will be moved to. Due to the closing of many European countries' borders, there is not only a backlog, but a low chance of even getting accepted in the first place. The result is huge. Overcrowded refugee camps, which can dwarf towns in some cases due to the mass of people living in them. Imagine that. A camp bigger than a small town, with people who can't work or supply for themselves. Logically, that only ends in disaster, both for the self-esteem of the people who are ensnared in these often hopeless-looking conditions, and for the logistics of the state or states who are subsidizing people who are not able to contribute back to them because of their own foolish policies. On top of that, because of the huge number of people, and the lack of resources to be able to adequately provide food, water, and shelter for all of them, there's also chances of crime beginning to occur. One case is the village of Moria, where the nearby camp has grown to such a scale that it dwarfs the town, and the refugees are so in need that they turn to criminal acts such as slaughtering local animals, stealing fruit off of trees, and even cutting down local trees for firewood. But these people can't really be blamed. If your family was starving and cold, and you had no other choice, what would you do? These people are, regardless of whether the world wants to acknowledge it or not, still people. Even after the horrors of World War II, the people of German descent and the German civilians did nothing wrong, yet they were shoved into these horrid, overcrowded conditions. People died of disease, starvation, and exposure to the elements in droves because of the logistical nightmare that the Allied powers put themselves in. In the current day, the differences are clear. The surrounding areas to Syria, countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, are all suffering a similar overcrowding and systemic overload that was faced by Germany and the Allied occupation forces after the expulsions began in 1945. People stuffed into camps, or avoiding camps and ending up in worse conditions than they would have been had they stayed in camps, is a massive issue in this time, and as opposed to lacking resources because of destruction, these countries are lacking services and infrastructure because of such rapid influx of people in a short and unexpected period of time. The European nations are slowly closing their borders, leaving people in rather inhumane conditions, in camps that were supposed to be temporary, which have now turned into bustling, overcrowded tent cities, with these tent cities dwarfing towns nearby. And then the U.S., such a wealthy country, only taking in 33,000 people? At the least, the United States is trying to settle people effectively, where they believe that these people will best be able to adapt and create lives for themselves. The only question remaining is, why is a country with so much wealth, power, and government resources not making a larger effort to take in people who are suffering? No, this is not to suggest open the floodgates and let everyone in. More to suggest that the U.S. should be playing its part, being efficient and safe about letting people in, but still allowing as many people as possible while following a safe procedure and to keep them out of horrible conditions.